Welcome back to the Royal Palace Podcast. I'm Liam.
And I'm Patrick. On this first ever crossover episode, we are joined by Olly and Marlon from the Flep24 Podcast to talk about the conviction of Marine Le Pen and her ineligibility to run in the 2027 French presidential election.
Unlike most English language reporting on this case, we get into the legal details and try to answer the million-dollar question. Is this lawfare?
If you enjoy this episode, be sure to subscribe to Flep24 wherever you get your podcasts.
Macron, do you know Macron? He's a very nice guy.
I want France to be a startup nation.
I said, Emmanuel.
France is an old country.
Macron.
To launch your business, to become a startupper.
No, you cannot do that, Donald.
Meaning both a nation that works with and for the startups, but also a nation that thinks and moves like a startup.
I said, Emmanuel.
Artificial intelligence.
I said, Emmanuel.
New mobility, new energy.
I said, Emmanuel.
Entrepreneur is a new France.
So Marine Le Pen was convicted a couple of weeks ago of the French crime is like misappropriation of public funds, but to all intents and purposes, embezzlement from the EU Parliament. The the judgment referred to her as sitting at the heart of a carefully organized system of embezzlement, by which fake jobs were created in order for the RN to take money from the EU that was supposed to be allocated to EU parliamentary work, like EU parliamentary staff, assistants, and that kind of thing, and that was instead allocated to the party and often the Le Pen family.
Now, why would someone do that with European money? It surely can't be that much money, right?
It is. It's European parliamentarians, MEPs, get a staff allowance of, I think it's about 28,500 euros a month, which is quite a lot when you consider that European members of parliament don't really have that much work to do. That can hire you quite a lot of parliamentary assistance. And at this time when this happened, starting in 2014, the RN, Marine Le Pen's party, was broke. They had constant cash flow problems. And so it is pretty convenient to, you obviously, if you're a party like that, you're a French party, you want to focus on French politics, and have got all this money to hire all these European parliamentary assistants, but honestly, you probably don't care that much about your work in the European Parliament. So what they did is that they hired all these people as parliamentary assistants who were actually doing work mostly or exclusively for the National Party and on electoral campaigns in France.
And so this brings us to the legal part of it, I think. And so the article, like the applicable article of the criminal code that applies here is Article 432-15, which holds that someone who has public power or a public mandate who destroys, embezzles, or misappropriates a document or a title or public or private funds is subject to up to 10 years imprisonment and a $1 million fine, or double the proceeds of basically what they gained or what was embezzled or destroyed. Something that's important about the way this crime is structured is that France doesn't really care if you embezzled for your own purposes, like whether or not you enriched yourself off of it, or if you misused or misappropriated or destroyed funds.
Because they're not accused of enriching themselves here. The people, they were not just, paying relatives or whatever. The people they hired were doing actual political work. They were just not doing the political work that money is intended for, which is specifically related to the work of the European Parliament, right?
Yep.
But that doesn't matter, you're saying.
And one thing I've seen, which I want to clarify, you heard our episode, what was the amount? Was it 4.1 million euros or 2.9? I've seen both numbers.
I've seen 4.4 now.
My understanding from looking at the case file is that this judgment relates to 2.9 million. The European Parliament accused them of a higher number, which I think was that 4+ number. I'm not really sure what the discrepancy is, but this judgment just relates to the 2.9 million.
I was wondering if it was because there's also like the longer period going back when the party was headed up by Jean-Marie Le Pen. She was involved in this, like the scandal in the system before that happened. So this guy, Ferdinand Le Rachenel, was an MEP for the RN. He had 2 assistants who he testified never actually worked for him, but they were in fact Jean-Marie Le Pen's private secretary and his Jean-Marie Le Pen's bodyguard. So I don't know whether that some of the money comes from that period where she was involved, but not like the leader of it.
Yeah, I think that's the case because this case is specifically relating to 9 MEPs and basically is about events happening during their terms between 2014 and 2019. And Jean-Marie Le Pen was not an MEP at that time.
No. And like you mentioned, no enrichment, like hiring of family members exactly, but it was kind of a family affair. Even though Jean-Marie Le Pen didn't end up being put on trial, that was only because a court found him ineligible to stand for trial because of his advanced age. Yeah. He also died last year, which I guess proved the wisdom of not including him in the trial.
That's really good for escaping criminal convictions. There was also another Le Pen involved who I'd never heard of before, Yann Le Pen.
Yann Le Pen, the sister, who is Marion Maréchal's mother. Marion Maréchal being the young rising star.
The United States has been seen as like the gold standard for this kind of law. And so countries in Europe have kind of been catching up and adopting American laws in their own ways on how to deal with like political corruption and like trust in politics, which is why if you look at the U.S. Code, Part 18, Section 641, you would find that the prison sentence for embezzlement in the United States is also 10 years. So, they're clearly looking over the ocean at the United States and building their law around it. But unlike the United States and unlike Brussels, French law doesn't accept legal corruption like lobbying. That is one thing that distinguishes American and French law in this respect.
Something that I think we should maybe get into now or a bit later on is like the question of, was this lawfare? Because the kind of reaction of a lot of the Anglophone left has been to assume that this must be lawfare. I'm not particularly convinced by the argument.
We have to have a definition of lawfare, and for me, one element or one indication of lawfare is when you denature the law, right? When you take the text of the law and make it say something it doesn't in order to get the outcome you want, or when you use it like inappropriately, like in a way it wasn't intended. I think that's where one of the elements of lawfare.
One of the things the prosecutors mentioned when they laid down the verdict was that the defendants didn't even really try to defend themselves against the charges. They completely denied them. They showed no contrition, no explanation for why they did it. They sort of rejected wholesale that what they were doing was illegal. And they argued that, in fact, the way they were spending some of their money, even for political work, was not improper. And I've heard that argument as well, that, well, parliamentary assistants do political work. What do you think of that?
I think what's happening here is, first of all, I don't think they could have fought on the facts of this case. We don't have total insight into this, but like in order to prove this case, there was a whole investigation that involved probably raiding offices, getting documents, interviewing people. I mean, it's hard to hide, I think, this kind of crime. We're not talking about money laundering where everyone is constantly like looking over their shoulder. This is the kind of crime where it's like you do it and you just hope no one decides to like target you. And, I know other people have said this, but I heard Yanis Varoufakis say this, which is like, yeah, this is like really common in European Parliament. It's like not even an open secret, everyone's doing it. So in that context, like I highly doubt they were using disappearing messages on Signal or whatever, right?
No, but so the weird thing is that Le Pen has sort of in interviews and stuff denied that this is a crime really at all after being convicted of it. I was watching an interview earlier with her on TF1 where she was saying that it is a administrative dispute with the European Parliament, which is interesting because it does appear to objectively be a crime. However, it is true what you're saying and what Varoufakis was saying about how this is extremely common in the European Parliament. I found a 2023 investigation by the organization Follow the Money that found that between 2019 and 2022, the Parliament itself caught 139 MEPs, which is almost 1 in 5, misusing funds meant for parliamentary assistance. And what they did in those cases is they just asked them to pay it back. And then there were cases like, Farage got caught for this and several other UKIP MEPs, and they didn't pay it back. And they had their salaries as MEPs docked, but their cases weren't sent to the prosecutors or to Olaf, which is the European Anti-Fraud Office that is supposed to be in charge of looking into this. Like, this investigation found that the parliament just like systematically doesn't pass this kind of thing on to prosecutors. And they didn't in this case either. Like, the admin of the parliament didn't. This got to the Paris prosecutor because it was referred directly by Martin Schulz in 2015, who was then he's from the German Social Democratic Party, and he was then the president of the parliament. So it does have some water, which he's saying that this happens all the time, and it's very rare that people get prosecuted for this. However, it's also the case that Modem, Prime Minister Francois Bayrou's party, I think it was 5 of their former MEPs were convicted of this. 5 were convicted of this last year. Bayrou was acquitted, but that acquittal is being appealed by the prosecutor, which I didn't know was a thing, but Patrick was explaining to me later. In France, I think that's an important part of this too, because Le Pen is appealing too. Can you explain, Patrick, that difference between like how appeals work in the U.S. versus France?
Yeah, so this probably owes to the fact that the U.S. Criminal system relies on jury trials, and jury trials are really difficult to organize. It costs a lot of money. Everyone needs to have the cases fully prepared in order to do the trial. You have no flexibility to reschedule, that kind of thing. And so as a result, like, the American system says, like, look, you get one trial in first instance, and then you can appeal. But appeal doesn't mean you get to retry the facts. It just means you get to challenge the law. So for an example I was giving to Liam earlier is like, all right, imagine Bob steals a slice of pizza from a gas station, or at least he's accused of that. He gets convicted, and you want to appeal that because you found new video that shows that Bob was not, in fact, the person who stole from the gas station. American law says, no, the facts were already crystallized in the first instance. You can't retry the facts. The only way that that video of Bob could be relevant, or not of Bob, of the real perpetrator could be relevant, is if the prosecutor had that evidence and refused to hand it over to the defense in first instance. So it's a procedural thing. France, operating on an inquisitorial system, says, no, people make mistakes, judges make mistakes, and juries make mistakes. By the way, juries were not involved in this case because this was a misdemeanor. But if it was if it was a felony, in that case, there would be a jury. Nonetheless, juries in France have a much more limited role. So when you go to appeal, you go challenging both the facts of the case and the legal questions. So you can bring that new evidence. You can argue that, you're not arguing. I mean, people know what happened in first instance, but you can completely basically retry the case. And that's really significant. However, that does come with some caveats. For one, both sides can contest a decision. So it's not like double jeopardy in the US, where if in first instance the jury says you're not guilty and we can't retry you, in France we can on appeal. And the prosecutor or the victims even can initiate that appeal. Marine Le Pen is in first instance, and now she's going to appeal, and she can contest everything. She can say, oh, actually, like, we didn't even do this. Whereas in an American court, you can only contest like the interpretation of the law, but the facts are usually unchallengeable.
Right. So that's one of the reasons, or the main reason she's saying that this is not a conclusive judgment, is because of this appeal working differently.
And when you're in front of an appellate judge in France, you're presumed innocent. And in theory, your sentence is suspended until the final judgment is given. So some people might choose to do an appeal even though they know they'll lose, in the hopes of just buying time. But it's a risky thing because they can actually make your sentence worse on appeal, right? If they gave you 1 year the first time, the appellate court might be like 5 years.
And that suspended thing brings up another aspect of the case, the fact that part of her penalty is, a 5-year ban from running for elected office. And it comes into effect immediately. And, that's been disputed by all sorts of people, including her. There's even a dispute, I think, about whether that is what the law says, because there's these precedents with local deputies, but Marine Le Pen, or like even local councillors, but Marine Le Pen and them have said that there's no precedent on national level deputies. Do you guys know anything about that?
Like, first of all, in France, we don't say there's precedent. We say there's jurisprudence, and that's meant to guide courts, but it's not binding in any way. Especially with the Trump stuff, you hear people say, we don't know what the law is. like, it's never happened before. It's like, why? Like, you can read, can't you? Now, jurisprudence changes the state of the law in France. I'm not going to deny that. But, like, I'm sorry, nothing in this article, right? It says, the act by a person holding public authority or entrusted with a public service mission. Now, she argues, by the way, side note, she argues that this means not European Parliament people or like MEPs, which let's put aside for now. But like the idea that this, like, there's an exception in here for national candidates, just because you haven't done it doesn't mean anything really. And it has been applied to national candidates, at least from the legislature. And the jurisprudence has basically said that, like, for parliamentarians, you can't stop their mandate or their time in office midway when it's like a provisional execution, which we'll get to in a sec. Because, like, being a parliamentarian is so much more about sovereignty of the nation and respect to the vote than like being a mayor. But like, that's just like, that's jurisprudence. That's not like the law saying like, oh, this only applies to locals and not national,
Part of the reason there's not any quote unquote precedent for this is that these are pretty recent laws she was tried under, right, Patrick?
Hey everybody, it's Patrick here in Post. So I just want to clarify the legislative history here. The article of the Penal Code under which Marine Le Pen was convicted was codified in 1992 and entered into force in 1994. Since then, the article has been modified several times. Additionally, in 1993, the Sapon Law was passed. It introduced new rules regarding the financing of political parties, imposed commercial transparency regimes, and removed corruption-prone intermediaries from certain commercial transactions, and sought to regulate public procurement projects. This, of course, was in the aim of getting rid of corruption and increasing transparency. In 2016, following the success of Sapon 1, as it's called, the French legislature passed Sapon 2, which would finally attempt to modernize France's anti-corruption policy regime, requiring large companies to adopt the famous compliance programs, introducing concepts like due diligence and providing for an important, if quite flawed, protection for whistleblowers. It also introduced a French equivalent to deferred prosecution agreements, an idea long rejected by many French jurists. Relevant to the Le Pen case is the fact that the penalty, the ancillary penalty of ineligibility for public office, became obligatory, or in Le Pen's own words, automatic. However, since this law came into effect after the facts of the Le Pen case, the judges were not actually forced by this law to declare her ineligible for public office. Instead, they chose to do so based on their appreciation of the facts of the case. And we get into this a little bit more in a minute.
Yeah, and to the point of like not being kicked out of office, one of the people convicted was also Louis Alliot, who's the mayor of Perpignan.
And Le Pen's ex-boyfriend, by the way, speaking of a family affair.
And he's going to stay mayor till the end of his term. I think they were they not married?
I don't think they were married.
No, they were just partners. Yeah. Okay.
But the reason I mention the Sapon laws actually is because they created over time these strict American-inspired but modified, American-inspired à la française regimes that sought to embolden courts, because the legislature felt that courts weren't using the tools that the legislature gave them, which is why they eventually would make the obligatory application of ineligibility, because they wanted judges to actually apply it. For our listeners, what we're talking about here is ancillary penalties. Americans would know these from, if you commit certain sex crimes, you have to register on a sex offender list. Because normally, what are the two punishments for doing crimes? Jail or fines. So Article 432-17 of the Penal Code says that when you're convicted of, embezzlement, for example, one of the things you risk is losing your civic rights, and then includes eligibility for public office, the right to vote, etc., etc. But it was in I believe Sapon 2, that they created the obligation for judges to apply that sentence. And they eventually had to go back on that because in France there's this idea of individualization of sentences. which basically means like, you know, in the US, there'll be like minimum sentence requirements. Like if you've done this kind of drug trafficking, you must go to jail for a minimum of 10 years. France rejects that. They say, no, judges should take into account the personality, the circumstances of the person and the crime, and craft a sentence. That's why when it says you're in, like when you read a French law and it says imprisonment of 10 years, it actually means of up to 10 years. And so anyway, they had to go back on it, and allows for judges to override the obligation to say that someone's ineligible for an election. And that was to be conform with the principle of individualization of sentencing.
Okay, so now we have this appeals process, and we could use the case to talk a little bit about like the structure of the French court system, as you explained to me recently. So they appeal to an appeals court, but how is that structured? Is it like, was she prosecuted in a national court, in a Paris level court, in a regional court? Maybe you could break that down a little.
Yeah, so, you know, the courts are distributed around the country just geographically. And obviously, unlike the United States, like they're not part of their department in any way. They're national in the sense that they, you know, all are part of the same structure. And so the tribunal actually that convicted her was the Correctional Tribunal of Paris. Correctional, it's called correctional because it's for like misdemeanors. And even though up to 10 years might sound pretty serious, this is considered a misdemeanor offense. And so if she was, for example, if Marine Le Pen had been a serial killer, she would have been at the special court for that, which is called the Cour d'Assises. And so, yeah, she'll appeal to the Paris like Court of Appeals. And then after that, she will have a definitive sentence, right? They might say she's not guilty. They might say she's guilty. But there's still one more recourse possible for Marine Le Pen, which is to go to the Cour de Cassation, which is the Supreme Court for the civil and criminal jurisdictions of France, not the administrative one, which is the Conseil d'État. And there it looks a lot more like what I was saying with a normal American appeals. They can say like, oh, well, the appeals court didn't correctly apply the law. Like, for example, they could be like, hey, actually the law, they could make the argument to the Cour de Cassation that actually this law, when they say public authority, they don't mean MEPs. So that's always a possibility, although I wouldn't count on it. Not legal advice.
That could take a while, right? Before we get a final resolution on this case then.
Probably in a year and a half, right? I think they specifically said they'll give a decision in summer 2026.
So the thing is, if that appeal gets rejected, she's then still banned in 2027.
Well, the appeal won't be rejected. She gets her appeal. In France, you have a right to appeal.
I mean, if the appeal finds her guilty again.
Oh, yeah.
Back in February, Richard Ferrand was this guy, Macron ally. He was sort of named as one of the new members of the Conseil Constitutionnel. And there was this speculation that because Le Pen had her deputies not vote on it, which basically guaranteed, abstain, which basically guaranteed that his candidature was approved, that she might be looking to get some sort of favor from the Conseil Constitutionnel with this guy Ferrand on there, who she considers more objective and less partisan against her. Why would she think that the Conseil Constitutionnel could help her? Is she wrong to, or?
That's an interesting question. So the Conseil Constitutionnel, which we call on our podcast at least one of the Supreme Courts of France, one of the 4 Supreme Courts of France. But the truth is, it's not really a court. It's a council, and it's a council that is basically appointed by the President of the Republic.
Oui, d'accord. Oui, d'accord.
Hey everybody, Patrick in Post again. I want to clarify the way in which constitutional council members are appointed. So, much like the US Supreme Court, France's constitutional council is composed of 9 members. 3 of these are appointed by the President of the National Assembly, 3 by the President of the Senate, and 3 by the President of the Republic. Unlike the US Supreme Court, these appointments are not for life. Instead, they serve 9-year terms, and each member may only serve a maximum of 1 term. These terms are staggered such that 3 members are appointed every 3 years. However, just because they're not appointed for life doesn't mean there's still a major or potentially major democratic problem with this configuration. To illustrate this point, let's look at who these people are and what their political affiliations are. So, the President of the Republic, Emmanuel Macron, of course, is a political figure and is going to appoint, or is likely to appoint, somebody who shares his center-right views. So we can consider that That's democratic in the sense that the president was elected, but of course that is necessarily a politicization of the Constitutional Council's role in society. And then you have the president of the National Assembly, which of course is someone who belongs to Macron's party. As a reminder for our listeners, their coalition, the presidential coalition, received only 23.14% of votes during last year's legislative snap elections. Then there's the president of the Senate. And remember, the Senate is not elected by direct suffrage, so already a democratic question about the Senate generally then spills over into the Constitutional Council, and it is a job presently occupied by someone who comes from the well-to-do right-wing party, whose party only received 5.4% of votes in last year's legislative election. So you essentially have, in the current state of affairs, the three people who are able to select the counselors for this, very important body that determines constitutional questions, three people from the center right to the right. Since Emmanuel Macron has served 2 terms so far, is currently in his 2nd term, the Constitutional Council is entirely composed of members that were appointed under his presidency. Sort of imagine if the U.S. Supreme Court was currently composed of all Republicans, which, let's be honest, we're going that way anyway. And so the stereotype might be that they're older, more politicized persons who sit on that court and are maybe less attached to the very rigid legal reasoning that, judges and prosecutors go through this special school called the National School of Magistrature, or Magistrature. And they have it, I don't want to say beaten into them, but they learn to think in a very rigid, conform way, see the law as this objective thing that they kind of apply. Whereas if you're on the Conseil Constitutionnel, you definitely have a much more political outlook on things. And in some way that's good. In other ways that might not be. So maybe there's hope that they will see Le Pen's side because they're the right, or that some of them on the Conseil are more politically aligned with the right. However, this is where it's kind of funny, which is that in American law, you can bring up constitutional questions at any time, right? In first instance, you can just be the law is unconstitutional here. That's not how it works in France. In France, if you want to get to the Constitutional Council, what you have to do, and Marine Le Pen tried in first instance, you have to do a special request where you basically outline why there's a constitutional question here, what your basis is, why it's a serious question, and it's basically a new and serious question. And then you ask the court that you're currently being tried in to then stop proceedings and send it up to not the Constitutional Council, but the Supreme Court of your jurisdiction. So in Marine Le Pen's case, they asked the Correctional Tribunal of Paris to send their constitutional question to the Court of Cassation. And then the Court of Cassation decides whether or not to send that further on to the Conseil Constitutionnel. This means, though, that if the first instance court, which by the way it did, it said no, we don't consider this a serious constitutional question, that she's barred from going to the Constitutional Council at this very moment. Now, she's going to probably try and bring up her constitutional questions again on appeal. And so if the appeals court has they think that her question is in fact serious, they could send it to the Constitutional Council. But this might never get to the Constitutional Council.
And do you think, Patrick, that I don't know what question exactly she wants to refer to them, but do you think there could be a case for the Constitutional Council here? Because like I mentioned before, Bayrou could potentially be convicted of the same thing. Mélenchon is actually also under investigation for the same thing. And he has been for years. There's no case against him, but it still could be plausibly the case where in the 2027 election, Le Pen, Mélenchon, and Bayrou are all banned from running. And that sounds pretty. I'm not going to say it sounds unconstitutional because I have no idea, but it certainly sounds like a democratic legitimacy problem.
Yeah. So I think the constitutional question that they posed was whether or not this applies to European deputies. That doesn't mean there's not other constitutional. What's the I guess it's mostly a political argument where you're saying if all presidential candidates are ineligible, then Is that something about like democracy or something, I guess?
Maybe this is asking too much of you, Patrick, but what is your, like, because this provisional execution, proximate execution, what's it called? The thing that means that the penalty applies even throughout the appeals process, means that she really is like running against the clock right now. Even if they like say they'll get it done by 2026, she's like spending a lot of time in limbo. And then my question is, do you have any sense of like a reason that the appeals court might rule differently this time? Because if she's running on the facts again and she just denies that it's a crime, like how could they possibly change the ruling? Like as someone who doesn't know anything about French law, like it seems to me completely like ludicrous that they would change that ruling if the set of facts are exactly the same and she's just maintaining the same position of I'm innocent, we're all innocent, we've done nothing wrong.
Right. Good question. So on provisional execution, because I don't think I explained that in detail for our listeners, but I'll do that real quick, which is basically there's certain things or in certain occasions we might, even though we know you still have a chance to do an appeal, there might be some reason to nonetheless apply the sentence to you. So this could be like, for example, if you're like a serial killer, yes, you aren't supposed to be sent to jail, but there's high risk you might serial kill again if you are actually guilty. So we're gonna detain you in the meantime. Another way, and this is where it applies to our case, is where if you think that there's like a risk that Marine Le Pen would do embezzlement again, or would have the opportunity to do embezzlement again, or maybe have the opportunity to like tamper with witnesses, or whatever. Like you can imagine like a situation where you have like a city mayor who is doing like mass corruption in the city, and like all of it controls everything, and all of his like cronies are on his side, that you don't want to put him back as mayor after he's convicted, even if it's not definitive. So that's where provisional execution comes in, and that's really where the heart of the sort of political controversy here is. And so, that's where it's up to the judge. The judge has to say, like, do I think there's a risk that you're going to do this again? And in this specific case, the judge said yes, or the judges said yes. And so what does that mean for the appeals process? Well, I think the judges in appeal could say she's guilty and maybe she should go to jail for 6 months. But because she is such an important political personality and it matters so much to the democratic life of this country that the election goes ahead as normal, we are going to not apply this sentence. So that's a reason she might appeal, and that's something she might get on appeal. Because why? And you ask why might it be different? Well, because the judges on appeal are older judges. Like they are more experienced. They've gone further in their career. One might speculate it's like they are more in line with judicial policy. So the thing is judges in the judicial system in France are free to do whatever they want. And there are there historically have been like far leftist judges who will they don't progress much in their career because they're openly political, but they'll just let people off for like stealing bread from the supermarket or whatever, because they think that's an injustice to convict someone. And, often that never gets appealed by the prosecutor because the prosecutor's like, I'm not wasting time on this. And so, it's not impossible that on appeal, Marine Le Pen hopes to find someone who's going to be like a little bit more moderate and like be like, well, I'm not sure I want to be the person who destroys some aspect of democratic life of the country.
Yeah, I think the judge said that she had a high risk of recidivism, and they mentioned in the justification for the conviction that what if she's then elected president? In the meantime, she could just. I think the president has a pardon power. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, and also has immunity from prosecution
while in office.
Yeah, well, as Nicholas is currently finding out, it only lasts so long.
Or Jacques Chirac, who is, I don't know if you know that whole case, but he was convicted of a very similar crime. The trial was ongoing while he was president. It was from when he was mayor of Paris. He was doing the same thing, but with fictional jobs in the Paris City Council. And Alain Juppé, who was his deputy mayor of Paris, another former prime minister, was convicted while Chirac was president. And Chirac, while he was president, refused to like testify. He refused to talk to like the cops, anything. And so they were only able to convict him on this once he was no longer president.
That's an argument that I've seen in the lawfare camp, that Chirac and Sarkozy got like smaller ineligibility penalties. So Chirac got 1 year, Sarkozy got 3. But I mean, even if she got Sarkozy's penalty, she would still not be able to run in 2027.
And so I guess the logic of the judge is that the reason she has to be barred is because if she then does get elected president, she could escape justice.
Yeah, maybe we should talk a bit about the lawfare element. Like, if lawfare is either, like, maybe it's a binary thing where, like, something's lawfare and something's not, or there's kind of, like, more of a spectrum, like, where do you guys plot this on the map? Because obviously Marine Le Pen wants you to think this is, like, the biggest scandal in history.
I guess lawfare for me is when they apply the law to my political allies, and
so you have everyone's definition of lawfare then. I don't think it's lawfare in this case, because it seems to me like applying the law how it's meant, as you said, how it's meant to be applied. Like, which is not to say that there's no reasons to like be suspicious of the law in France. Like, some of the stuff that happens to protesters, I think, is quite dubious in the way that they get sentenced. And like Bernard Arnault during the Squassini affair.
Look, Canard and Chenet reported before that trial that LVMH pulled all advertisements from any publication that was reporting on it at all, or even covered the case.
Yes.
But that's a whole other rabbit hole, isn't it?
Yeah, so I just about the lawfare thing, I don't really know what lawfare means, and I'm not sure I really care either, but I do think it's interesting to compare it to like what other people are comparing this to. For one thing, Varoufakis says his whole point, which I think I definitely agree with, is that there should be no circumstance where like someone's made ineligible from running for public office because they were convicted of a crime, and especially a crime that is, relative, all things considered, this minor. You look at a lot of the other crimes that people compare this to, and this is nothing. However, that's a disagreement with the French law, with what the law says, and not with what the court did here. I have no reason, from what I understand, to think that the court did anything wrong here. I mean, or that they had any choice other than to convict her. However, it is absolutely true that this kind of fraud is endemic in the European Parliament. Lots of fraud is endemic in the European Parliament. But I just want to compare it to, like, so people are comparing this to the Georgescu case in Romania, which seems to me, I don't know that much about the case, and all the stuff that's really on it is Romanian. I was trying to find if I could find anything detailed about it in English, but I couldn't. But like, I don't know, did you follow that at all, Ollie?
My understanding of it is that Georgescu won the election. There was evidence, I don't know how credible, of Russian meddling in the election, and they've decided to rerun the election banning. My
understanding, and again, this is probably an incomplete understanding, but they didn't win the election, but he came second in the runoff. So he was headed to,
right,
they have this, they've basically, as Patrick was explaining to me earlier, based their political and legal system off of France. They're huge Francophiles in Romania. And so they have like a 2-round system like France. And he came second, this far-right candidate, and pro-Russia candidate. And the court ruled, and the election committee ruled, that this TikTok campaign that was allegedly financed by Russia was the reason he won, and that was therefore a reason to annul the results of the election and render him ineligible to run in the rescheduled election, which is coming up sometime this spring. But then there was some reporting that revealed that actually this TikTok campaign was not financed by Russia. It was financed by the Liberal Party in some bizarre attempt to like create a bad look for him. I don't know exactly what that was, but anyway, that seems like a whole different type.
Yeah, I mean, even if a social media campaign had been financed by Russia, that still seems like democratically incredibly dubious to me to bar someone from standing, because it's like, well, foreign states interfere in other countries' elections. That happens. The US does it. Britain does it. And like, you'd have to rerun like every election in the world if the second there was any kind of evidence that a foreign state was like trying to do something. You would have to rerun them all.
Yeah, I agree. So that the Romanian thing seems like that's a completely different level of just sort of, I don't know if that's lawfare or not, but something that is definitely something we should oppose on democratic grounds. And then that Greenwald video that Patrick mentioned earlier, he mentioned both Lula and Bolsonaro. And that also seems to me like the Lula case was completely different. In the Lula case, like, it was revealed when he was imprisoned and made ineligible to run in 2018 that the judge, Sergio Moro, and the prosecutor were conspiring specifically to prevent him from running in 2018. And then that same judge was later made Minister of Justice under Bolsonaro. So again, that sounds like lawfare to me on a completely different like scale, or just a completely different kind of thing. And then I looked up what Bolsonaro has just been charged with, and he's charged of plotting to poison Lula and shoot a judge. So
I mean, that sounds plausible. Like, I don't know anything, but like, he no smoke without fire when it comes to Yair, I'd say.
Yeah, he hasn't been convicted yet, but it's still just this narrative that there's this pattern of lawfare, by liberal orders around the world. Seems to me that if you look at the details, we're looking at some very different cases. And then also France obviously also has a history of convicting high up politicians for crimes. Fillon, as we mentioned, no, we didn't mention Fillon, but Chirac, Juppé, Sarkozy, and Fillon, who was like in 2017 when François Fillon was first charged with, what was he charged for? Basically the same thing, but related to the French Parliament, employing his wife.
Right? Yeah.
That was worse because like he was accused and convicted several years later of employing his wife in a completely fictional role. Seemed worse to me. Like she wasn't just doing a different kind of political work. She was just, everyone said, no, we've never seen her in Parliament, and she's technically been working here for 10 years. Like she was just a completely fictional, job and embezzlement. But that's a very similar case of this happening, because when that case was first, or when that scandal broke out, when Canard Enchaîné reported it, he was leading the polls for the election, and that destroyed him. So I don't know. It doesn't seem too out of the ordinary to me.
Yeah, I agree. And basically, as far as I can tell, people seem to be confusing two things. They seem to be confusing a principled stance against the idea that the law should be able to bar someone from running for office, which is completely fair enough, and I can't basically agree with. Mm-hmm. And with the facts of the case being that the law has intervened specifically to target Le Pen. And it's like you can hold one opinion and still think that this went ahead as the law suggested it should. Your disagreement, as you said, is with the French law. I think this also does raise like another interesting question, which is like, how should political parties finance themselves? Because I feel like kind of hanging over this is the fact that like, I don't think the RN is like an anti-establishment party in any meaningful sense, but certainly back then, they kind of had some kind of anti-establishment credentials because no one would work with them. Like they were seen as like way beyond the pale. It's hard for parties like that to get financing, and that's true on the left as well. But obviously, like if you're a party like of capital in the center, you can raise infinite money just by talking to like your friends in finance or whatever like industry. And I'm not gonna like I don't cry any tears for the RN really, but it does sort of point to like, how are you meant to fund yourself as an anti-establishment political party? And like, yeah, well, it's the EU. Like everyone hates it.
Yeah, it's. I hadn't even thought about that aspect of it honestly, because I think Patrick and me coming from the US, for us, any issue with political financing in France seems like nothing compared to the issues with political financing we have in the US. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think, what I wanted to bring up here that I feel like no one's really making this about is the European Parliament. This stuff is endemic to the European Parliament. Again, 1 out of 5 MEPs are caught for doing this. Probably way more are doing this or some form of this. And this is just one of the expense accounts that MEPs have. MEPs have a general expense account of 5,000 euros a month. And this, when it was first explained to me by someone I know who was working as a parliamentary assistant, I was like, that can't be true. They're given this as a lump sum, and they don't have to submit receipts to justify it. Like, what other expense account in the world works like that? So if you're in the European Parliament, you just get so much expense money, not to mention the salary is pretty damn good, and then your job is nothing. Like, I mean, not literally, but for most people, especially if you're an opposition party, what on earth is your job in the European Parliament? Nothing. That's why the Parliament's notorious for having like terrible attendance during debates. Actually, they have very good voting attendance, but that's just because you can get your expense accounts docked if your attendance falls too low. That's their main way of making people show up. But I was reading about this. It's notorious that when there's a debate going on, there's like less than 100 people out of the 720 people in the European Parliament who are actually there, and then everyone just floods in to vote, and they leave. And in fact, even Ursula von der Leyen is notorious for, and a lot of people have complained about this, that when she like has a speech or something, she leaves immediately. She never hangs around for the debate. No one takes it seriously. And so it's like, yeah, for most political parties in Europe, the purpose of the European Parliament is to be a piggy bank to fund real politics. And that's kind of understandable.
I do get it. Like, well, do you want to go? Do you want to take the playing pretend in Brussels seriously? Like, it's kind of the thing that like really stood out to me in the judgment. This was like the one bit of it where I was like, I don't really understand how that's in there, and maybe you could like clear this up, Patrick. But they talk about in the judgment, the one bit of it that was like kind of political at all was the fact that they were talking about Marine Le Pen was at that time the RN was a Eurosceptic party, and they were talking about how they wanted to constantly destroy the EU, and the judgment like kind of referred to the fact that they were like just absolutely like taking tons of money, embezzling tons of money, and while making all of these statements about how they want to get rid of the EU, want to destroy the EU, and that was like, it was kind of an anti-democratic move that they pulled, which I found quite... I mean, I understand that like the institutions have to pretend that the EU is, you know, the beating heart of all democracy, but I kind of thought that was odd that was in the judgment.
Yeah, so this is under circumstances of the infraction. As I said, it's irrelevant from a legal standpoint whether or not the deputies, like the MEPs in question, managed to enrich themselves for them to be convicted. That's obviously like the circumstance that it was for their political movement in France ought to like play a role in like how the judges decide, right? Because I mean, Liam kind of alluded to this, but like what Fillon did, where he's just like letting his wife like have like a slush fund by giving her a fictitious job, that's pure vanity, right? That's just corruption. Whereas what they're doing, like, you know, maybe it's still illegal and it should be punished as such, but like maybe it doesn't deserve the same like maybe she doesn't deserve the 10 years in jail, right? I mean, I think she was ultimately sentenced to 6 months, right? With a bracelet.
It feels worse, even if it's not legally considered worse.
Yeah, I mean, because you could argue there's some value to what the RN... I'm obviously not because they're the RN, but like, if you were that way inclined, you could argue there was some value to what they were doing.
They were doing a real job, at least. They were doing something.
Yeah. Who knows? Maybe Penelope's handbags were vital to the functioning of French democracy.
At the end of this section here, where they talk about like the impact on the European Parliament, on the electoral pool, etc., they say it is these circumstances that must be taken into account in order to pronounce the complementary punishment or the ancillary penalty of ineligibility.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it just kind of struck me as odd because it's just weird to see anyone taking the EU seriously. I don't know, maybe that's what unsettled me about it. Where I was just like, I've not heard anyone talk like this for a long time.
But, you know, constitutionally, we have to pretend this is a democratic institution of the French state, right?
Well, and you have to remember that I don't know if we mentioned this on an earlier one of our episodes, but I think it's always kind of an interesting fun fact, and especially if you're American or British even, the way it works in France is EU law is above national law on like hierarchically. The only thing that stands above EU law in France is the French Constitution. So yeah, I mean, you can't you as a liberal institution, i.e. the courts, you can't be like, oh yeah, that thing's a joke.
Yeah. Even, I mean, like, it's just funny to hear it referred to as like, oh, this is an anti-democratic like contournement. When it's like, well, I'd argue that that's the EU itself, to be honest. But
right, probably this is actually a very democratic thing to do. It's you're subverting an anti-democratic institution.
Right. It might be worth, Liam. I don't know how much you remember from your time studying political science, but do you have much of a recollection of how undemocratic the parliament is? It's
very undemocratic. I mean, again, you mostly don't do anything. Like, as an opposition member of parliament, you can't introduce laws, for example, which you can do in the French parliament. Although
but even if you do, the cycle, right? Like, it's not like they vote on a law and it instantly becomes law, right? Like in a normal parliament.
And there's like the whole, like the Varoufakis thing of like the parallel institutions that exist within the EU to insulate the EU even from the EU's own, like the incredibly limited democracy in the EU. It's like, well, actually, nothing relating to the budget is decided here. It's decided in this like secret meeting of central bankers, and
And like, even if you ignore that, like, there's like parallel institutions. It's like the European Parliament is the only institution of the EU that has any sort of democratic legitimacy. And it's not that it has no power, but it is, I think, uncontroversially, like indisputably, the weakest of the major branches of the EU. Theoretically, the fact that they have some say over the Commission, like that is that's sort of their main power, is that they can cause the Commission to collapse. But I think that's only happened once. Patrick, we need to do an episode on the EU at some point. It's just such a headache to think about it. But it is kind of fun also. This sort of brings me to what impact it's going to have. Not just in the election, but generally for the RN. Because I think part of it is that this crime really seems, I think, to most people quite insignificant. And part of that is that it's like so few people take the European Parliament seriously. And also her crime seems kind of technical. If you don't know the legal details of it, you're like, okay, I guess you're not technically allowed to do that, but it still seems like they were using money meant for political assistance to pay political assistance to help, so I struggle to see this as something that was going to delegitimize her in any sense for many people. Could obviously do the opposite.
Yeah, I there've been like a few takes going around about this, and I kind of disagree with everyone. And as much as a lot of people seem to think this will like martyr her and turbocharge an anti-establishment vote, and I just don't get that sense either. But I'm also like, I don't think it's going to do that much damage to them because Bardella is very popular. The vote, I don't think it is a personal vote. Broadly, I don't think everyone's voting for the RM because they love Marine Le Pen. I don't think she has that like tribunician appeal.
Very different from Trump, for example.
Yes, yeah, really different. If Trump were to go, then there would like the whole edifice would collapse, and they would break back into all the different factions, and people are very much voting for him. Whereas I really don't think that's true for Le Pen. So I think her vote could transfer pretty easily over probably to Bardella. The thing that I think maybe is worth watching is whether or not the civil war between him, like very cold civil war between him and Marion Maréchal, reopens, because she formed that weird little grouping Identité Liberté a few months ago, which is like whenever a French politician forms a micro party, our rule on Flep is that they are at some point going to try and run for president. If they have like a mini party within the main party that they sit in, they have presidential ambitions. So like, and then her and Bardella don't like each other, and they're about the same age, or she's a bit older, but like they're both young. So like maybe that could fuck them up a bit, but I don't really see what impact this has. It's kind of a bit. I know it's massive because it stops her from running, but it also doesn't feel like it's that big a deal.
I mean, in my view, and this is purely a vibes-based view, but I very much feel that like Marine Le Pen was very necessary to shed the openly fascist, like, pro-Holocaust image that party had, and bring it into the kind of like coded world we lived in for the 2000s, where you say, no, we're not racist. It's just we don't like other people, And I kind of feel like I've always felt her time is up. And I think Bardella, like, he has problems. Like, there's a world in which, as you suggest, like, he doesn't consolidate power and it doesn't work. But I almost see him as like the right figure to get like the sort of dying off LR, like, for our listeners, Républicain, like the right, well-to-do party, to getting all those people fully in the Rassemblement National, the right wing, the far right wing party that Le Pen's a part of, wheelhouse. And also he has this air, unfortunately, of like just enough respectability to probably pull, in my mind at least, some of the more right-leaning Macronists, because I feel like it's like the Le Pen name has helped the party in many ways, but it's also hurt the party because as you said, Olly, it's not really an anti-establishment party, but it kind of is an anti-establishment party so long as it wears the Le Pen name.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think I agree with you that I don't think like, oh my God, this changes everything either way, but I do think it opens up an interesting presidential election where you could have Bardella, who pulls the center right while keeping the far right and also motivating a younger, like, online right. That might be enough to destroy the center. I don't know.
No, I completely agree. I mean, like, as you say, like, it's probably time has come for a candidate not to have Le Pen attached, because, like, He's got no baggage. He's like 29. He's not. I mean, he's been in the RN, but that's not a problem at this point. And he'll be running with the RN. He's not denied the Holocaust, like, that we know of. So he doesn't have to reckon with, like, this history of, fascism, pujadisme, like, the fact that the party was founded by Jean-Marie Le Pen alongside Pierre Bousquet, who was in the SS. Like, that lineage then goes, and he can sort of wipe the slate clean. And I don't think he'd lose anyone.
No, because they're all mad about Le Pen. You don't have to like Bardella. You just have to be mad about Le Pen if you're on that part of the right.
And the only thing I can think is either he's like, because like sometimes you hear rumors that the RN deputies don't trust him that much because he's like, sometimes he gets called out on TV like a deer in the headlights. I mean, but like that's stuff you can learn. Like he's only 29. He can still learn his like interview technique or whatever. But maybe he's so untested because he's never had to do anything proper that he's actually really incompetent and no one knows that. But I don't get the sense that that's true.
Hopefully, that might be.
Yeah.
The only thing that saves France from a far right president is if he turns out to just be useless in like debates.
I don't remember the source or if a source in the screenshot you sent me, Liam, but didn't you show me some sort of like early polling that was suggesting Bardella is wildly popular?
Yeah, he's polling very well, way ahead of anyone else, I believe.
I saw a poll that had him as the French people's preferred candidate to run. So it was like, who would you like to see present themselves in 2027? He was number one.
Above Le Pen.
So,
wow.
Yeah, he was above Le Pen. She was number two.
Yeah, so, man. So this might be doing a favor to them.
All right. So to wrap this up, last thing, we have a tradition on the Royal Palace podcast. I don't know if you guys have a similar one, but we like making predictions. Which two parties will be in the second round in 2026?
Okay, I'm going to have to give the negative prediction because I don't like what I'm seeing with Ruffin at the moment. It looks like we're going to have two kind of relatively strong candidates of the left in Mélenchon and Ruffin. That's going to split the vote. So it's probably going to be Bardella versus a centrist. That centrist is either going to be Edouard Philippe or Dominique de Villepin. So Bardella versus one of those two.
I do not have a good read on who on earth the Macronists, like how popular either of those people are. I can't imagine Edouard Philippe getting popular appeal, but you never know. So I don't know. I'll give the optimistic prediction, even though I don't really believe in it, that it will be Mélenchon versus Bardella.
I share in that one. I agree. I think I have a little bit of misplaced hope. My vibe is that this has to happen at some point, and like it can't be center right versus the far right. It just can't be that way forever. And I think the Macronie has been delegitimized. I mean, you meet any normal person, and they don't maybe have like a huge grasp of politics, but they know something's wrong.
Yeah.
So I want to believe that it will be LFI, Mélenchon versus Bardella, or maybe Le Pen if she gets this lifted. But yeah, I think it's going to be far right versus far left.
However, I would extend that prediction out to say that I think that the trend all throughout Europe is the center right and the far right merging. Not just that the center right is becoming the far right, but that they're just merging into like a anti-immigrant establishment blob. I mean, look at the Netherlands and Italy, far right governments that haven't really done anything, and they definitely haven't shaken the EU order at all. So I think that's probably what we'll head to with a Bardella or Le Pen presidency, is nothing different.
To your point about Edouard Philippe and the like illegitimacy of Macronism, I agree. He's polling quite well at the moment, but I think that probably does go down when people remember that he was like Macron's prime minister during the yellow vests and stuff. But maybe that's where de Villepin comes in, because de Villepin is clearly floating himself to be PM. He's not got the stain of Macronism on him. He's relatively popular because he has taken a courageous stance over Gaza. He's been more right than other people about foreign policy for the last 2 decades. He made the speech against the Iraq war in the UN. And I would also have agreed that LFI were definitely going to get in to the second round, or I would have predicted that they did, if Ruffin wasn't doing what he's currently doing. Because I think like all the other candidates, of the potential candidates of the left, Marine Tondelier, Olivier Faure, Fabien Roussel, or whatever other kind of, soft left ghoul that they can throw up, none of them, I don't think, have anything like a kind of actual personal vote, and they don't really have a programmatic vote either. So even if they glob together, I don't think they get much. Ruffin, however, does have a different appeal. He does have something of a personal vote. He was very popular among the yellow vests. And he can kind of play that unity figure while also getting the dynamic of like a personal vote. So I think that then splits the left vote basically in half. And then that, like maybe I'm completely wrong. Maybe Mélenchon, there's something I can't see happening, and Mélenchon crushes him like he's crushed everyone else at every other point. But the fact that Ruffin seems to be doing this campaign and seems to be putting himself forward for president is, I think, a damaging prospect for La France Insoumise.
Yeah. Do you think you could explain that?
Yeah, so Ruffin was in La France Insoumise. He is a former filmmaker and journalist from the north in Amiens. And he has historically been on the radical left, but he has taken this line since 2022 that the radical left won the battle. They convinced everyone else that you had to be radical in order to win. And so the project now, he says, is unity of the left on a radical line. And what he means by that is keep most of the economic program, talk a lot about work, but moderate the line on anti-imperialism and race and policing. So not be like explicitly racist. Like he's not gone down the route that some French politicians have, but he keeps weakening the line. And as far as I can tell, it seems like he's willing to sacrifice more and more and more, but while keeping this like kind of patina of radicalism. And it's the fact that he does have that like credible patina of radicalism that's the problem, because he can absorb like a part of like the rupture vote and also have the like left unity behind him, because I think everyone knows that he's not that radical. There's a book I've not read, but the title is good, and I do need to read it ahead of 2027. It's like Ruffin, the Story of an Opportunist or something. And just more and more of what he does, you get the sense that he's just doing things very opportunistically. If he'd waited for Mélenchon to have his last shot, and I appreciate that like people might say to Jean-Luc Mélenchon, well, you've had 3 goes, come on now. But either way, LFI keeps increasing their score. They've proved themselves a unique force in Europe, and so it's kind of not unreasonable, I think, to give them the benefit of the doubt, vis-a-vis like trying again. If he'd waited, he could have been the candidate in 2032. But he's decided now is his time, and I think this is a problem.
I want to just say one thing to wrap this up. Like, you remember how Jon Stewart's Daily Show used to do the moment of Zen at the end of every episode? I've got this. I read about the case of a Mr. Hubert Falco while researching for this, and I didn't get a chance to bring it up, but this is too good not to bring up. Have you heard of this guy? I saw him brought up in several things about the debate about Le Pen, because he was convicted of embezzlement. He was the mayor of Toulon. In 2023, he was convicted of embezzlement and sentenced to 5 years of ineligibility. But here's what he did. He had a much more creative mode of embezzling of funds. So he was the president of the Departmental Council of Var from 1994 to 2002. And then when he left from 2002 until 2018, while he was mayor of Toulon, he had a free open table kept for him at the council's cafeteria where he could go to eat every day. And more than just that, he had food delivered to him from the cafeteria, prepared by the departmental chefs, including on weekends and holidays. And they had a special fridge just for this food. So this was known as the fridge affaire, l'affaire du frigo. And he had the departmental council do his laundry. And he had 2 employees of the council work extra hours for him. All of this for 16 years after he had stopped being a member of the council. The dark side of this is this was uncovered when the head chef of the council killed himself and said that he was being threatened and apparently lots of people involved, all the chefs were getting death threats to not reveal this. It's bizarre. He's from Horizon, by the way, Edouard Philippe's party. But I was just like, what on earth is this case?
That's such a mismatch between like what you're doing and like how you're keeping the silence.
Right, like, yeah, I'm getting free food and death threats and driving people to suicide to wrap it up. But hey. Thanks, Olly and Marlon, for inviting us to do a crossover episode, and thanks everyone for listening. If you haven't listened to Flep24, make sure to go check them out on your favorite podcast app and on Patreon. Patrick and I are going to be bringing you more great content in the coming weeks, so stay tuned. And if you enjoy listening to the Royal Palace podcast, please consider sharing us with friends.
La France est une chose, à mes yeux, très considérable. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Je veux dire par là qu'à mon sens, elle est quelque chose de très grand. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Il y a même là quelque chose d'extraordinaire. La France joue son rôle, c'est exact. Et pour qu'elle joue son rôle, il faut qu'elle soit la France.